Thank you for joining us for this webinar on safety of journalists and impunity in Africa. My name is Nompilo Simanje, and I'm the Africa Advocacy and Partnerships Lead at the International Press Institute. We are hosting this webinar also in commemoration of the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. For those who are unfamiliar with the IPI program, the Africa program, we monitor and collect data on press freedom threats and violations across the continent, including threats to journalist safety and gendered attacks against them, both online and offline. We also use this data to carry out evidence-based advocacy to hold states and other duty bearers accountable for their responsibilities to press freedom and to ensure that journalists can carry out their work freely, independently, and safely. As part of this program, we also publish a monthly newsletter highlighting our monitoring work, developments in the region, events and interventions by our Africa members. We also produce a monthly fact sheet with gender disaggregated data on press freedom threats and violations, the nature of attacks, the distribution of attacks across the different countries, but also the nature of the perpetrators. Recently, we have also been producing resource toolkits covering the frameworks for media freedom and access to information at the Pan-African level, as well as one for Zimbabwe, which we released around the time when Zimbabwe had elections in August. But also this toolkit summarized domestic, regional, and international frameworks for protecting press freedom and access to information that could be useful for journalists and NGO stakeholders. And also through these toolkits, we spotlight some of the existing laws that undermine these fundamental rights. We are in the process of also producing more toolkits focusing on Senegal and Kenya, so do stay on the lookout for those briefs. And as noted from our title for today's webinar, we wish to explore solutions to the arising issues in the region as far as safety of journalists and impunity in Africa is concerned. And we hope that we'll be able to come up with concrete recommendations on what can be done to address this issue. We also note that there's a lot of work being done in the region by different actors at various levels. And from this conversation also, we hope that we can discuss ideas in terms of what more we can do and possibly what we can do differently. We have therefore been joined today by a panel of speakers that will shed light on experiences in various countries, mainly Cameroon, Sudan, Somalia, and Nigeria, but also will highlight or discuss regional mechanisms and how we can utilize them to promote media freedom. Without wasting more time, allow me to move quickly to our speakers. We will start off with Abdelmoniem, who is representing the Sudanese Journalist Syndicate from Sudan. Abdel, I hope you can hear me, and if you're ready, feel free to go ahead. His screen seems to be frozen. I'm not sure if it's just me.
Yeah, well, I think he's muted. You need to unmute. I hope he can hear you.
Yeah, maybe for now we can move quickly to Abdalle Mumin, who is representing Somalia Journalist Syndicate. Abdalle, over to you.
Thank you, Nompilo, and good morning to you all, to my fellow panelists in this wonderful discussion today about journalist safety in the midst of the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists. Journalists across worldwide, you have seen an increased level and the trend of attacks against journalists from Ukraine during the past 2 years, and recently what's happening in Gaza, where journalists have been repeatedly targeted. In addition to that, in our African context, journalists have been suffering for quite a number of years in different contexts, in the larger East African or the Horn of African, and in the context of Somalia, a country that has been in an active conflict since 1991. From the record, you all know about the cases of journalists who have been killed CBJ documentation shows that more than 85 journalists killed since 1992. For our record, Somali Journalist Syndicate, just in 4 years, the past 4 years, we have lost 8 brave, prominent journalists in different parts of the country. All have been killed just because of their profession. They have been actively reporting issues with regard to human rights abuses, insecurity, government wrongdoings, and these continued attacks against journalists still persist. And we are sadly witnessing that the number of murder against journalists is increasing. Just for your record, 3 weeks ago, we have lost a very brave journalist, Abdel Maalim Noor Qais, who was the director of the Somali cable television and independent television in the capital, Mogadishu, after he was killed by a suicide bomber who targeted him. This is a very stark reminder of what journalists are going through in Somalia. And I want to highlight that despite Al-Shabaab being the prominent group or the primary instigator for these attacks against journalists, the country's national security, intelligence, and the police, as well as corrupt government officials from different parts of the country, are also part of the perpetrators. And that is why we are witnessing the lack of the will to investigate the crimes against the journalists in Somalia. The government, whether the federal, which is based in Mogadishu, or its regional states, have experienced an excessive and broad powers through the media and the way they report. This is the true reality. This is what we have been witnessing. And just in collaboration with our network, IBI, we have drafted a joint letter to the authorities in Somalia, to the Somali Attorney General, and to the Somali Ministry of Information, just to call for them and to remind them about the responsibility that they have to take steps to investigate attacks and the violence against journalists. I hope that they will listen to this call, and I hope that journalists in Somalia will have a safe environment that is conducive for them to operate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abdalle. That was quite brief, but also straight to the point. And you highlighted, all these cases with the documentation reaching up to 85 journalists that have been killed. And I think the question is always, so how many of these cases have been thoroughly investigated and prosecuted? And I think I appreciate also that you highlighted who the perpetrators are, indicating that the largest perpetrator is, the Al-Shabaab, with most of the killings being, bomb attacks, but also that the national intelligence and the security forces are also equally perpetrators. Thank you so much for, shedding light on what's happening in Somalia. I will jump quickly to Abdelmoniem again from the Sudanese Journalist Syndicate. I hope you can hear me. And if you're ready, do feel free to proceed. Your mic is muted. Abdelmoniem, I'm sorry, can't hear you. Your mic is muted.
Yes. Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, now we can hear you. Thank you. Okay. Yes.
Okay. Thanks again to the IBS and our colleague from different parts of Africa to share with us the information about the situation in their countries, and to create type of advocacy in Africa to support our colleagues in different parts of our continent. In a brief, and I concentrate on the situation of the Sudanese journalists during this war, which Now it's 7 months. Starting last April and it continue until now. Now almost the war is covering more than 50% of the country. It was expanded to different, start in the capital, and now it was expanded to other regions. Almost 50% of the country now under the war. Now the fighting just 70 kilometers. During this war, we lost 4 journalists have been killed. Most of this killing by RSF, Rapid Support Militia. Last cases, it's our colleague Halima Muhammad Idris, just 2 weeks ago, while she was reporting to her TV, local TV, it was crushed by a car to Rapid Support. And before that, our colleague Assam Marajan, he was found shot inside his house in the area under control of Rapid Support. And also before that, our colleague Assam Al-Haj, a photographer, while he is covering the war, he was shot dead. And our colleague Samahir in Darfur in West Sudan, she was killed while she are trying to fled from the fighting. She was shot dead, and part of her family also have been shot. Plus those 4 have been killed. We have 30 journalists injured while they are covering those fighting, and we have 150 their houses have been looted, their cars, their furnitures. Most of them now they are displaced. Some of them are displaced inside the country, others are neighboring countries. 50 journalists, their families, part of their families have been shot dead inside their houses. This is in general situation. Also of her media house is broadcasting from the inside area, and this is create another crisis, economic crisis for the Sudanese journalists. They lost their jobs, they lost their incomes, and even some of them they cannot give the basic needs for their families. And some of those media house have been bombarded, and the equipment have been destroyed. The most tragic things, the archive of Sudanese radio, which covered from 1946 up to now, it's under the fighting area. No one knows what's happened to it. Is it still safe? It have been burned because Sudan National Radio, it was controlled by support from the day 1 of the war, and it's an area of exchange of fires between the 2 parties, and there is a bombarding, there is air strikes. We don't know what happened to this archive. We talked to the UNESCO, to every international organization to find a way to rescue this archive, because if it will gone, Sudanese people will lose 72 years of its archive. In general, the situation of our country, situation of our journalists. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Abdelmoniem, and I really appreciate how you expanded in highlighting the situation of journalists in Sudan who are reporting in the midst of a war, and highlighted their experiences not only with regards to journalists that have been killed, but also some that have been injured. and also even, families that have been implicated, and also that even media infrastructure is being destroyed in the process. And thank you so much for shedding light on that. Colleagues, if you have any questions, if you require any clarity from our speakers, feel free also to send your questions in the chat, or use the plenary session to speak. And I think at this stage, I'll also move to Tobi Soniyi, who is the legal advisor for IPS National Committee in Nigeria, but also is the Deputy Director for News at Arise Television in Nigeria. Over to you, Tobi.
Yeah, thank you once again for having me. Well, impunity against journalists is common in Nigeria too. However, I must make a clarification that impunity is not limited to journalists alone. In Nigeria, it's common, whether individual, to students, to private citizens. So it's something that happens often. I understand the peculiar nature of journalists, because sometimes you can be in a bus, police will stop you, search you. It could be a student, and the student will disappear from there. So impunity in Nigeria is a general thing. However, because of the nature of the job that a journalist does, we also face additional challenges, because we want to expose what people in government don't want to be exposed. So this year, September, we lost a colleague of ours. He works with a government media organization, the Voice of Nigeria. They project the government, so obviously the government does not have any reason to kill him. However, you never can tell. The police came out with a report that he was killed by his cousin. That is the police version of the event, that the cousin had demanded for assistance from him, and that when he did not render it, he colluded with some of his friends to come and kidnap him, and 3 days later, he was found killed in a septic tank somewhere in northeastern state of Zamfara. We lost him. Then 2 years ago, a journalist a parliamentary journalist, he covered the National Assembly. He was very critical of his state governor, of Benue State in the north central Nigeria. 2 months earlier, he was attacked. Then later, he disappeared. After 3 weeks, police said he was killed by in a car accident, and that his remains was deposited in a private one. It was a cook and book story that was not believable. It's obvious that the Vanguard correspondent, the guy was killed, but according to the police, it was an accident. It happens, really. I wouldn't want to spend much time bemoaning this situation. I did prepare some recommendation that I think there will be food for thought for us moving forward. That when this thing happens, we are quick to accept the security agency versions. We don't often demand for further proof or try to establish another plausible reason why the person could have been killed. So we need to push more and get answers for some of these occurrences. Then in Nigeria too, there's another problem. Journalists are often not paid. We have journalists who are owed 8 months' salaries, and sometimes this push them into compromised situation. They need to survive, and in the process, they get involved in an ethical thing. So we need to push for greater professionalism and better governance of pay and contract between journalists and employers. And like we say in Nigeria, we monitor other people's businesses while we allow our own to suffer. A journalist who has not been paid for 8 months is likely to be covering a protest of some worker protesting non-payment of 2 months' salary. Even him that is covering has not been paid for 8 months. So we often abandon our own duty while we fight for others. I think this has to change. I find out working with IPI in Nigeria that we need to educate law enforcement agencies because they see us as enemy. In Nigeria, we try to explain to them. For instance, during last general election, we wrote to the Inspector General of Police and everyone in security agents that we need to educate them that constitutionally we have a job to do. You also have a job to do. Our job, they are complementary. We are not there to disturb you. So don't be there to disturb us. And we think that by trying to, because some of them in security, they believe that journalists is their enemy and they must do everything to stop journalists from working. So we've been able to make some inroad by educating them. And I think this needs to continue. In Nigeria too, I discovered that our big men, they like to travel abroad. So other subtle means we use to rein them in. We meet with embassies. We solicit their support that any government officials who violate the rights of journalists should be denied visa to their country. This hurts them more than anything because they like to go to US, they like to go to London. If they know that they are not likely to get visa to UK or US, they are likely to think twice before harassing journalists. We find that this won't has impact on them. I commend it to other countries too. We also need a standing legal defense fund, I believe. In Nigeria, there is no fund that protects journalists. There is no fund to fight for journalists. We can't hire lawyers to go and make case for a journalist that is detained. This needs to change. There is no insurance in Nigeria. I know in abroad there are insurance for journalists. We don't have it, but we need to push for it. Besides, we need to anticipate threats as journalists. We cannot continue. It's not business as usual. If you're going to cover an event, envisage what is likely to, be problem, the challenges. If you are working a very deep investigation and you think that somebody can come after you because of this, we don't need to be naive. Time for that has passed. As journalists, we need to envisage this. And I also think the issue of training for our members is very important. We just had one in Lagos and in Abuja. We were lucky to have MacArthur Foundation support. And it's been very interesting because we observe over the time that media owners don't spend money on training. They don't train there. And in Nigeria, you find somebody who graduates from the humanities because he couldn't get a job. He suddenly become a journalist. He has no training. He doesn't understand libel. He does not understand the ethics. So it is through this kind of training that we're able to bring them in. And when we do that, we strengthen professionalism. And I think so far so good. It's like a drop in the ocean, but we have to continue to do it because the response shows that we are doing the right thing. And I commend this to my colleagues as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tobi. You jumped straight to the aspect of what can be done. And thank you for sharing those recommendations. We'll open the platform again later to discuss more recommendations. But I also appreciate how you linked the overall welfare and working conditions of journalists to how it also compromises on journalist safety and security. I am looking for our next speaker, Bernice from Tiger Eye, to speak about the state of safety of journalists and impunity in Cameroon. But I don't seem to be seeing her from the list. Maybe just to confirm quickly, Militza, is Bernice in the room? Not yet. Okay. No, that's all right. I think we can proceed. Remember, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to throw them in the chat, but also we'll have a plenary shortly after our speakers have laid the foundation to this discussion. I'd want to move now to Marystella Simiyu, who works with the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, to just take us through the available regional mechanisms and how we can utilize them to promote the safety of journalists and also to counter impunity. Over to you, Marystella.
Thank you very much, Nompilo, and thank you to IPI for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen afterwards. Sorry, share my video afterwards. So for now, just let's deal with the screen that I have here in front of me. So good afternoon to everyone. My name is Marystella Simiyu. As Nompilo mentioned, I work for the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. I'm also undertaking my LLD here, working on a human rights-based approach to media protection and how it impacts on elections. So you can see issues of media rights is quite central to my research work. But for the purposes of my presentation today, I was tasked to speak about utilizing the regional frameworks for the safety of journalists and countering impunity for this particular webinar. Let me see my screen. There we go. So for the structure of this presentation, because I have only 15 minutes to speak, I thought I could just first zero in on the African continent, given that we've already had examples about the situation of journalists in the African continent, speak about the regional frameworks that we have, as well as the regional mechanisms that have the mandate to protect and promote human rights with regards to the rights of journalists in the African continent. But why is it important for us to look at regional human rights systems in the broader discussion around the safety of journalists? When you look at what we have in the African continent, we actually do have bodies and norms that seek to protect and promote generally human rights, but specifically the rights and the rights of journalists in the African continent. And we do have regional human rights mechanisms that have the mandate to implement these instruments. And it's important for us as stakeholders to know about these frameworks and work together to ensure that they are able to effectively exercise their mandates, see how we could support them towards undertaking their mandates, and also hold them accountable to undertaking their mandates. But just as a starting point, when we look at Africa, we do have the foundational document on human rights in the African continent, and this is the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. Relevant to our discussion today, we look at Article 9, which protects freedom of expression and access to information. It guarantees generally freedom of expression and access to information, which we know is critical. It's a cornerstone of the work of journalists. Media freedom falls under the broader umbrella of freedom of expression. But just beyond the protection and the guarantee of freedom of expression, we see other rights in the African Charter that are relevant to the work of journalists. When we talk about the right to life and integrity of the person, and just listening to the presentations that have come before me, we see that these are violations that have been suffered by very many journalists in the African continent. And so other rights to the right to life, freedom from torture, cruel and inhuman treatment, right to fair trial, the right for journalists to associate if you want to form trade unions and other organizations. This is a right protected under the African Charter. The right to freely assembly, the right to movement, because you need to go from place to place in the course of your work, as well as just general, equitable and satisfactory conditions in which you work in. These are rights that are protected in the African Charter. And importantly, as I say, the African Charter is the foundational document in the African continent. And it has been ratified by all African countries apart from Morocco in Africa. And by saying that, we mean that actually all the countries in Africa do have obligations under the African Charter to respect, protect, and fulfill these rights. And so as a stakeholders can actually hold them accountable to their obligations under the African Charter on Human People's Rights. But moving on, we also have the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance. And this has been ratified by at least 38 countries in the African continent. And as the title suggests, it seeks to promote democracy, elections, and governance in the African continent. And specifically on journalists, there is a provision that requires states to protect freedom of expression, in particular, the freedom of the press, and to foster professional media. So there are obligations to states in this regard. But moving beyond the two binding instruments I've talked about, the African continent has gone further and elaborated on how states can better protect and fulfill these rights under the African continent, in specifically freedom of expression and media freedom. And one document I feel that is very important in this regard is the 2019 Declaration on Principles of Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. This document was adopted by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights in 2002, but it was later revised in 2019 to better adapt to the developments of the digital age, as well as the threats and challenges being experienced when it comes to the exercise of freedom of expression and access to information in Africa. It does indeed strengthen the protections of freedom of expression that is guaranteed under the African Charter. And that is just a picture of this particular document. You can easily find it online if you want to read it further. And maybe just to flag some of the provisions that are relevant for our discussion today is Principle 19, which calls on states to ensure that there are no undue legal restrictions when it comes to practicing journalism. And already just listening to the presentations again, we already see this manifesting in different contexts in Africa. Journalists are allowed to freely assemble. I'd already talked about that. But moving on, this declaration does impose certain duties on states. And as I said, as stakeholders, we do need to hold our states accountable. One, when it comes to the safety of journalists and media practitioners, that's provided for in this instrument. States are also required to undertake any measures to prevent attacks on journalists. And this could be done by states and non-state actors. I remember in one of the reports that we've had today, there was a suicide bomber who targeted a journalist, and as such, states have an obligation to hold such a person accountable, given that this is an attack on a journalist that has been undertaken by a non-state actor. States also have a responsibility to raise awareness and build the capacity of journalists so that they know what are the laws and standards that protect them, and also ensure the safety of journalists and media practitioners in this regard. In the event that there are any violations, infringements on the rights of journalists, states are required to ensure that they do undertake proper investigations. If prosecutions are necessary, this has to be done and the perpetrators punished, as well as the victims given access to effective remedies. If this is undertaken by law enforcement agencies, and we have had many reports of law enforcement who are complicit perpetrators in violations targeted towards journalists, they need to be held accountable. The declaration goes further and does bring in a gendered perspective, because we do know female journalists, by the nature of their work as well as the nature of their gender, they do have specific unique challenges that they experience in the context of their work. Here we're talking about sexual and gender-based violence, intimidation and harassment of journalists, female journalists is something that is uniquely experienced by them. And states have to actually look at these experiences through a gendered lens and find protections for female journalists. If they are operating in a context of conflict, states have to protect and ensure that journalists are recognized as non-combatants. These are provisions that are in the 2019 declaration that speak specifically to the safety of journalists in Africa. And states have an obligation to ensure they implement the provisions of this particular instrument, which provides further guidance on Article 9 of the African Charter. And moving on from the norms, we do have regional mechanisms that have the obligation to ensure the implementation of these regional norms. I will highlight two that I believe are very important in the African context, which is the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. It's based in Banjul in the Gambia, and the African Court on Human and People's Rights, which is based in Arusha in Tanzania. The African Commission, if I can start with this particular body, does have a mandate to protect and promote human rights, as I mentioned. When we talk about their mandate to promote human rights, here we're talking about how they are required to collect certain documents and take studies about the state of human rights in the African continent. They could organize events such as seminars, conferences, where there are discussions around issues of human rights. And I don't know I'm sure some people have attended some of the events that have been hosted by the African Commission. And it usually provides a good platform for substantive engagement with different stakeholders in the African continent, including journalists, so that we can share experiences of what is happening in the African continent and find solutions towards the state of human rights in the African continent. The African Commission, in undertaking its promotional mandates, also has an obligation to formulate and lay down principles and rules on human rights and fundamental freedoms, which African governments should base their legislation. So just going back to the declaration that I spoke about, these are rules that were developed by the African Commission, and it does impose obligations on states on how to implement this through legal measures. What laws do we have in place? And often, if you look at research around media laws in the African continent, or broadly laws on freedom of expression, you see a number of them fail to sufficiently provide for enabling environments for media, as well as effectively protect the safety of journalists. And this is something that violates the very principles that are laid down in regional norms in the African continent. But beyond that, the African Commission has a protective mandate here. They can determine certain cases with regards to violation of human rights. And if you look at the jurisprudence from the African Commission, there are actually a number of notable cases that have sought to protect the rights of journalists. I just mentioned two there, one against Nigeria that was brought by Media Rights Agenda and others, and another one that was brought by Article 19 against Eritrea. So there are progressive judgments that have been passed down by the African Commission that seek to hold states accountable for the violations of journalists. However, as much as we do recognize the importance of this regional body, there are challenges to engaging with this particular body. To start with, just on a practical note, are logistical challenges. The African Commission, as I mentioned, is based in Banjul. Usually, most of the sessions happen in Banjul. Currently, the African Commission is having a session, an ongoing session, their 77th session that is happening in Arusha. And so they're just logistical challenges if you want to attend the sessions, if you want to engage with this particular body. There are logistical challenges in terms of the costs incurred in traveling to these areas. In Banjul, it's quite a long distance of travel, and sometimes it might dissuade certain organizations and individuals from actually attending sessions, which provides a good opportunity to engage with the Commission. But if you want to actually more formally engage with the Commission, another impediment to this is that you're required to grant, if you're an organization, you need observer status to formally engage with the Commission. And of now, it's a little bit over 100, is it about 500 organizations that have observer status before the Commission. So this does provide a challenge to formally engaging with the Commission, but otherwise, regardless of whether you have observer status or not, you can attend sessions of the Commission and find ways of engaging with the Commission and flag any incidences or violations that have been experienced by journalists. Issues of delay in facilitating certain access to information is another challenge of the Commission. If you go to their website, you will see details about what's ongoing right now in terms of any communications that they have determined. Any emerging issues that have been decided by the Commission are all available on their website. But sometimes when it comes to, for example, after the session, when they need to put out statements of the decisions, it might take time. And this might interfere with how certain stakeholders want to plan on how to effectively engage with the Commission. There's also a concern that the Commission is vulnerable to interference by state parties, as well as political organs of the African Union, which does impact on its independence. When it comes to exercising their protective mandate here, when submitting cases on violations of human rights, you do require a bit of patience, because some cases will take up to 8 to 10 years to be determined by the African Commission. Although, as I've said, there have been a number of progressive judgments, it does take a lot of sustained intervention here to be able to wait the whole process for the communication process. The African Commission itself is a quasi-judicial body, meaning that actually the determinations of the African Commission are non-binding, which now brings in the challenge of enforcement with state parties. You might have progressive judgments coming from the African Commission, but holding certain states to enforce and implement these decisions becomes a challenge, which now really waters down the impact of the judgments passed down by the African Commission. Moving on to the second body I thought to highlight is the African Court on Human and People's Rights. This court was established in 2004, and it seeks to complement the protective mandate of the Commission. But unlike the Commission, it's a judicial organ and it does make binding decisions. But still, they do suffer from lack of implementation and enforcement by state parties, which now goes to a broader need for us as stakeholders, for journalists, civil society organizations, academia, and other stakeholders to push state parties to implement decisions when it comes to violations of human rights and hold them accountable to the obligations under the regional framework. But like the African Commission, other than the issue of enforcement, there are challenges to engaging with this body. The African Court can only be accessed by individuals and NGOs where their state has made a declaration under the protocol establishing the court, accepting the competence of the court. Unfortunately, as it stands in 2023, only 8 countries have made this declaration, which means that this court is inaccessible to many individuals and NGOs in the African Court. The unfortunate thing is that when you look at the cases that have been submitted to the court right now, most of them have come from NGOs and individuals and none from states the last time I checked, which means this is a platform that is mostly used by NGOs and individuals, but unfortunately, many of them in the African continent cannot access it. Like the African Commission, the duration of cases is very long. The court also suffers from under-resourcing and poor compliance with timelines by parties, which does impact the strength of this body that we have, the ability of this body to effectively undertake its mandate. But that being said, we do recognize that the court has actually passed down very important judgments that seek to protect journalists in the African continent. And one of these is Konate versus Burkina Faso. And so there is need to actually seek ways to ensure that this court is able to effectively undertake its mandate. And I know my time is running out, but I thought to just note that as it stands now, we have the regional norms, we have the regional mechanisms, but we also have special mechanisms that seek to ensure and promote the implementation, seek to undertake the protective and promotional mandate of these bodies. And I thought to flag 2 special mechanisms, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information. The current Special Rapporteur is Honorable Tobi Sunu, who is responsible for this docket, and another Special Rapporteur, important and vital for the protection of the safety of journalists and generally the protection of human rights defenders in Africa, is a Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders and focal point on reprisals in Africa. The current Special Rapporteur is Honorable Remy Lumbu. And so I believe as stakeholders, if we work together to help them undertake their mandate, they undertake research on the state of the safety of human rights defenders generally and journalists in the African continent. They do conduct missions from time to time. They do seek to promote the implementation of the different instruments that we have on human rights. They record violations and really depend on journalists, civil society organizations, and other stakeholders sending them the information to inform reports of the state of human rights in the African continent, the state of journalists in the African continent, violations at the state level. They do really rely on all this information coming from the different countries. So as stakeholders, we do have a responsibility to share this information with them so that they on their end can undertake the necessary research. If it's issues of communications, they can exercise their protective mandate and determine violations of human rights. They can undertake country missions and just generally ensure that the states are held accountable to the obligations under international law when it comes to respecting and protecting human rights, as well as holding them accountable in the event there are violations that touch on journalists. And so I'm just going to end my presentation here because I think I have gone a little bit over time. And if you have any questions, we can engage further on this in the plenary session. Thank you very much. Nompilo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Marystella. I really appreciate how you emphasized that we need to hold states accountable, and you emphasize the role of states, including that, for example, in environments like Somalia, where the operating environment is not conducive, they have to take preemptive measures to prevent attacks on journalists. I thought that was quite important. And of course, you know, this is something that was raised also at a recent meeting that we had at the ACHPR in Arusha at this ongoing session on online safety of female journalists. And one of the participants emphasized that, you know, states actually have a role to play as well as far as promoting safety of journalists is concerned. So I really appreciate also that, you know, as we're unpacking all these mechanisms, you highlighted that states have commitments, states have responsibilities. And I think at this juncture, I want to open up the conversation to colleagues for comments, for feedback, but also even for additional recommendations in terms of what can be done. Our speakers, feel free also to jump in terms of what can be done. So I'm seeing there's a question here from Afia Ofosu, who is saying, aside from press releases and calls to action, what else can be done to resolve cases where the prosecution of the offenders has reached a standstill? What else can we do, you know, apart from our statements and our calls to action? And I want to open this up to our speakers. If any of the speakers is willing to take on this question, feel free to raise your hand.
Thank you very much. May I jump in?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I really salute the presentation by Marystella, which was very wonderful and up to the point. And sorry to hear that only 8 African countries have adopted or approved it to the court. And I think it's our responsibility as civil society, civil society groups in Africa to also campaign for all African countries and states to join to this court and so also to accept the jurisdictions of the court. So coming back to the question, it is really, really important to note that kind of frustration is everywhere. Apart from call to action and statements, what else can we do as civil society? And this calls to action, that is what I have been highlighting 2 days ago here in the conference of the Journalism Week, where I have attended. And I want to state 3 points here. Number one, it's important for the African journalists and their organizations receive the necessary backing so that they can have the ability and the power to hold and stop the unrelenting violence against the journalists and the media community. This, what I mean here, is to give the support that encompasses a concerted effort to eradicate all kind of violence against journalists and to stop the impunity. It can be giving them sufficient mechanisms which can give them the power to seek accountability outside in their countries, even if they can't get that accountability inside in their countries. In many, many African contexts, it is impossible for journalists to go to the court and seek legal redress against attacks against the colleagues or themselves. Like my case, it's very impossible for me until today to go to a court in Somalia and seek for justice for the crimes and the attacks perpetrated against me in the past 8 months. In that case, I will really recommend that there should be some kind of mechanisms for journalists like me, that they can go other places where they can find justice, they can bring the case against the perpetrators. This is an important. It can be somewhere inside Africa. It can be somewhere in Europe. But I want to highlight that kind of importance. That, I think, goes beyond what we call to action or press statements. That's number one. I also want to highlight what my friend Tobi said earlier. We have to push, in the IPI can play this a very vital role. We have to push democratic countries in Europe in such kind of mechanism where upholding democracy and press freedom and human rights come together by imposing visa restrictions and asset freezing on individuals and officials who have been found perpetrating attacks against journalists. As Tobi said, many of these African leaders prefer to go and live in Europe or somewhere in America or Canada after their retirement or even after they just step down from the office. And that is where they like to live, them and their families. So if they know that they will not be able to go to Europe because there is a visa restriction, or Canada or America, then they will think twice in perpetrating attacks against journalists. And that is a very important thing for many cases. Empowering journalists also can become a very good point when it comes to just implementing actions, immediate actions. Journalists in Africa nowadays need equipment, they need expertise, they need the skills to make them feel safe and enhance their safety and security. And I want to highlight that, I think. Finally, a lot of financial resources given by the international community, whether it is Europe or America or Canada or UK, to Africa countries is going to the governments, not to the civil society. And we have also to push to call very clearly and honestly that international community should also think about allocating portions of this funding to the important civil society groups. When you are underfunded, it is very likely that you will not achieve your mandate. That's very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Abdalle, and for jumping onto the question. I think I just want to circle back and ask one more question to Tobi around the issue of public interest litigation. Journalists willing to take on public interest litigation where their safety is being compromised, especially by state actors, and what can be done also to cultivate an interest in journalists to also institute public interest litigation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I hope I heard you right. Well, in Nigeria, we do have some lawyers that provide free legal services, and I mean what we call pro bono cases. But I must emphasize, from my experience in Nigeria, we discovered that most journalists and media organizations themselves don't often comply with the law. You know, there are laws, you pay tax, you do this, you know. In fact, in Nigeria, we have discovered that the Nigerian government is quite very generous with journalists, because if they want to shut media organizations down, they just need to look at their tax books. Most media organizations don't pay tax. They don't pay ground rent. They violate virtually all the law. All the government needs to do is to look at the book and say, okay, fine, since you didn't pay your tax, then why should you continue to operate? So first and foremost, media organization needs to understand the law under which they operate and comply with them. We have in Nigeria, they deduct pension from, journalists. They don't remit it to government. They deduct tax. The journalists cannot get tax clearance. These are bases that government can invoke. So within our jurisprudence, jurisdiction rather, in whichever country that we operate, we need to identify those laws governing our operation and ensure that we comply with them. Then back to public interest litigation. There are some organizations I'm not sure they are limited to Nigeria. I can share the list after this meeting, that some of them are abroad, some of them scattered across the world, that provide support for journalists. Even if you need to relocate, some of them will help to fund your relocation if they know that your life is under threat. So I'll pass the list of some of these organizations we can share with our colleagues, who can then, based on their peculiar situation, they can apply to this to get support, whether as litigation, or some of them even provide, like MacArthur Foundation. If you have been assaulted and you need treatment, they have some funding for it. So maybe in our next discussion, we need to look at some institutions that we can run to for help, that are already on ground and helping people. I will share the list with the Secretariat after the meeting. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Tobi. I think I appreciate you highlighting that, there are various forms of support being provided by different stakeholders in the region, different forms of support, be it legal, be it medical support and the likes, which I think is also important to promoting the safety of journalists. And I see that Benice has joined us. She's from Tiger Eye in Ghana. Benice, can I pass on the mic to you for a few minutes to also share your thoughts around, safety of journalists and impunity in Africa, particularly focusing on Cameroon, but also you can throw in some examples from Ghana. Benice, your mic is muted. Maybe while we wait on Benice, I don't know if there are any questions or any comments from the panelists, if you have any further recommendations.
Maybe, Nompilo, as we wait for Benice, I just wanted to speak on something that Abdalle mentioned in terms of we need another place in the African continent to go to when our state level is not working out, when our own leaders, the violators, are not making use of the local instruments that we have and the local mechanisms that we have. Actually, the African Commission and the African Court is the other body that we can go to. Of course, there are others at the UN level, but just coming closer to home, we have the African Commission and the African Court that you can go to. When you have any violation, if you have any reports that you need to share with, if it's a case that you want to institute, it can be done at the African Commission or the African Court. If there are reports you want to flag, you can reach out to the different special rapporteurs for the human rights defenders or the one for freedom of expression and raise the issue. Because we do have these mechanisms in the African continent and we just need to make use of them and empower them to be able to exercise their mandate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marystella. And I was just also wondering, in terms of the challenges that you highlighted earlier, are there any other mitigation ideas that have been thrown around, in terms of how we can ensure that the African Court, the African Commission, the special mechanisms are fully utilized? How can we circumvent some of the challenges that you highlighted?
So one of the challenges, for example, the African Commission mentioned in terms of it takes a long time to decide some of the cases that they have. One of the challenges, that is one of the challenge, I would think, when I was doing a research one time, just looking at the feasibility of these mechanisms, and I was talking to some of the people in the African Court and the Commission, and they mentioned sometimes it's just the petitioners themselves, the applicants themselves, you're given a timeline, you don't meet the timeline, and because of this, it also makes it difficult for the court itself to quickly decide on a case. So as litigants, if you're able to actually also respect the timelines and push states to respect the timeline, that helps. In terms of logistical challenges, the fact that it's difficult to go to the session, for example, in Arusha right now, how many people had the money to actually go to Arusha and engage with the commission? There are some bodies that do offer scholarships. So if it's not something that is in the budget of an organization, you could look for scholarships that allow you to travel to the session and find ways to engage with the sessions. But there's also the NGO forum at the African Commission, it brings together CSOs, NGOs, journalists, and through this particular forum, it can help NGOs to be able to come up with one unified statement that they can use and give at the African Commission. So when you make use of the NGO forum, they have a website, you can look at their website and see how to participate and make use of the NGO forum. It does help to create an avenue where civil societies, journalists can come together, share their different experiences from the different countries in Africa, and then together, collectively, a statement can be developed, and this statement can be read out during the session. So it does give collective force to non-state actors on how to engage, not individually, but together with the African Commission. So those are some mitigate the challenges.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Marystella, for highlighting that. And I think what we are seeing really is that there are several mechanisms that we can utilize. And I was also thinking that these are not just mechanisms for civil society, even individual journalists, media outlets can also interact with all these available frameworks, you know, to promote the safety of journalists and counter impunity. Now, I just want to wrap up the conversation. I think Benin's network is acting up because she left at some point.
Okay. Can I just mention one thing?
Sure. I think as I wrap up, I can. Yes. In wrapping up, I'll start with you, Marystella. Maybe you can give us one key takeaway, and we can do a rundown with all the panelists as well as we wrap up the session. So we can start with you, of course.
Okay. Thank you. Before
Sorry,
I do my, I just wanted.
Marystella, can I ask for a minute? I want to see if you can still accommodate it too. In Nigeria, I mean, in West African sub-region, we do have ECOWAS court. We have ECOWAS treaty, and this has been really very helpful to journalists. We have challenged some very bad law, and ECOWAS court has struck it down. I don't know in East African region and Southern African region, what are the situations there with some of these regional, I mean, sub-regional, let me put it that way.
Yeah, I was actually, you just stole the words from my mouth because I was mentioned the ECOWAS Court of Justice, because I feel it has been actually quite instrumental in terms of the decisions that it has reached recently. It did even give a decision against Guinea, the internet shut down. It has done one for Nigeria. I think the ECOWAS Court of Justice is doing well as a sub-regional mechanism. I was just going to talk about that. And so I'm glad that you flagged it. I know in the East African region, we have the East African community, of course, but we have the East African Court of Justice. It has been used, I know, by Tanzania, for example, when it comes to violations of the rights of journalists. And that is also a notable one. SADC, the SADC tribunal has had problems, but it is there, but it has been quite a difficult one. It has not been as, I would say, as impactful, let's say, as the Court of Justice. But this is just to show that we actually do have these mechanisms that we can use at the different sub-regional levels. But now to go to my takeaway, and just listening to the other panelists, thank you very much for your input. We can see that the contemporary challenges that are being experienced when it comes to the safety of journalists is something that has been there in the African continent. So it becomes worrying that how are things, we are just seeing a decline when it comes to protection of media rights and freedom of expression. And we do need to actually sustain our advocacy in that regard and hold our states accountable. Sometimes it's difficult, it's a threat to one's life and livelihood, but I believe, as I said, collectively, we do need to continue sustaining this. And I know that the African Defenders, for example, African Defenders is developing a report on this that should be released, I think, next year on the state of human rights defenders in Africa. And I know journalists were flagged as an at-risk group in the African continent. And so when we have this research now, it now goes to advocacy. How do we work towards advocacy and ensure that we implement the recommendations of all these reports that we are getting from the African continent? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marystella. Can I move to Abdalle? Any last recommendations, last words, key takeaways?
Yeah, thank you very much. We need to just be very clear about the fight for press freedom and protection of journalists. It's not just our struggle in the Africa continent. It is just also a global struggle. So we have to bear in mind on that. It is a fight for the truth, justice, and the fundamental principles of democracy. That is why protection of journalists is so important in every context. And I want to express my frustration, and the frustration is of the African journalists in the international community, including organizations like the United Nations, the European Union, the African Union itself, who have just failed in the responsibility to speak out against the violations against journalists and the media workers in the world, in Africa, especially in Africa. Have you ever seen any single statement from the African Union on the issue of media freedom in Africa? Have you ever seen? No. Have you ever seen any statement from European Union condemning attacks on journalists in Kenya, for example, in Somalia, for example? No. So my question is, why are these international bodies, the African Union, the UN, the European Union, are so reluctant to speak out on these violations? It is their mandate, and we are calling them today that they should break their silence. They have to speak out. They have to say something about attacks of the journalists. And that, I think, can add something, some level of protection to the journalists. And finally, I want to highlight that we need also to come together, all of us, to underscore the vital and the necessary for providing protection to the journalists. Civil society, different groups, media groups, we have to come together in the protection and the providing the support we need each other. For example, journalists in exile. Think about Kenya. Think about journalists from Ethiopia, Tanzania, who are coming to Kenya and have no mechanism of support whatsoever, networking. So let us, among ourselves, come together and see how we can support also to local journalists and the media and journalists who come into the exile. And also let us reiterate and say again that if journalists cannot get justice in their own countries, we have to work hard to make sure that we can pursue legal action in other contexts. In that way, we can make sure that journalists attacks and we can send a message to those who attack journalists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abdalle. And you did highlight also one other issue around the plight of journalists in exile. I remember, I think this was one also topic that we discussed at our 2023 IPI Congress in May in Vienna this year. So for those that are not aware as well, we have started planning our 2024 Congress, and do ensure that you check out our website on more details around the Congress. If I can move forward to Tobi, your last words, possibly in a minute or under a minute. Thank you.
Yeah. We also need, I think, we also need to adopt engagement. Everything doesn't have to be adversary. We have been able to get journalists released, IPI, by merely calling the authority that detained the person. So sometimes we have also been able to save some broadcasting organizations from being closed down because they are owing government. They are not paying their license fee they were owing. So we call the Broadcasting Commission and ask them, can they pay, can we stagger the payment? If they pay for 1 year, and they agree. So engagement is very important. If you do have authorities that are listening, please engage with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tobi. Abdelmoniem, I'm not sure if he's still in. I'm not seeing him here. Abanga Benis is back. Do you have maybe any last words? First words, rather. Any few remarks? Okay, I'm not seeing it. Ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to thank you very much for joining us this afternoon as we're discussing safety of journalists and impunity in Africa. And I appreciate all the recommendations that have already come up from this discussion. I hope that we can continue the conversation and of course, stay on the lookout for our fact sheets, our resource toolkits, and our Africa newsletter on all issues pertaining to safety of journalists in the region. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.